started. And it's part of the series we have on FactGrid projects with different problems and different features of the software Wikibase we're using. And the project today is Adam Anderson's project from Berkeley to get objects for all cuneiform database objects for all cuneiform objects that have been found, quite a number of 350,000. And that's an exciting perspective, just as it is extremely exciting to think about a whole community of researchers working with these objects across all languages. So I'm looking forward to your talk. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm grateful to be able to talk here and especially for all your help and assistance with FactGrid and getting the account set up. This work that I'll present today is in partnership with many of the existing databases, many scholars and Assyriologists in the field that include the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, ORAC, the online global repository for Cuneiform, and GLOW, a project that's been focusing on the geographic locations of the tablets, along with a couple of UC Berkeley Discovery data science projects, one on Sumerian networks, reconstructing the Sumerian networks from a group of 15,000 tablets from one site, and the Ancient World Citation Analysis group that has been working on all the bibliographic references that surround these primary sources. And obviously getting that all into linked data is really exciting and also poses a lot of challenges. But I think, so I'll start by kind of taking a look at what we're talking about here. These are, like I said, not cookies. There's a funny story behind that. The scholars shall remain nameless, but the kind of older generation of scholars used to keep these things in their house, you know, because not too many people can actually read them. When he was out, his cleaning lady came in and saw a bunch of cookies lying on his desk, or biscuits, as she called them, and tossed them in the trash. So you can see that they're in different states and conditions of completeness. Some of them are only fragments, and sometimes they're preserved well, and other times they're slowly decaying. It depends on how much salt is in here. But these are clay tablets. Many of them are wrapped in an envelope of clay. And these tablets in particular come from a site in central Turkey called Kanesh in antiquity. The modern day site is Kultepe. There's so far been 22,000 tablets that have come from that site alone that we know of. And so these things kind of come out of the ground, you know, chunks at a time in hordes. They tend to initially be kind of discovered on the antiquities market. These were initially found in the late 1800s by some of the people working in the British Museum who were traveling and looking at the souks, the markets. So they eventually figured out where these came from, and proper excavations began in the 1920s with the Prague University, and it has continued after the war with the Turkish authorities. But this is just one case in point about the kind of data that we're working with. It is piecemeal. It's coming from a number of different places. It currently lives and is housed in a number of different places. These came from a photo I took in the Anatolian Civilizations Museum in Ankara. And access, of course, to these tablets is really limited typically because they're very rarely on display in a museum. they live in cupboards. So in thinking about linked data, the idea is in order to to use linked data and structured data to make these tablets more useful, more accessible, and queryable. And obviously, to those listening, linked open data is the highest standard. So moving in that direction is very exciting. To get URIs, permanent IDs for these objects will be a game changer for computers. And that's, of course, one of the audiences that I think about that not every seriologist thinks about, but the idea of including tablets as objects in this semantic web would allow us to start linking machines that are speaking to each other and allow programmers who know machine learning to use this data at large in mass. Well, specialists still work one tablet at a time. There's a growing interest to use this data as a whole for language modeling. So one of the other reasons that is driving me personally has to do with the looting that is a continuous problem. And as you can see here, the revenue that came, to these rogue groups like ISIS, a part of their, income comes from excavations or looted sites, and so they look at the antiquities coming out of the ground as a kind of natural resource that they can make a profit on. And the buyers are not always aware. For example, well, here we can see other sites. This is one of these sites is Draham, a site in south of Baghdad, and they'll come in with either backhoes or even just shovels. And when they find the palace, typically they're looking for palaces. they will hack at it. So one of the companies in the US that got caught red-handed with some of these objects, it was Hobby Lobby. And as it turns out, they spent 1.6 million procuring these objects, and they were in their museum for a few years before they were noticed that they most likely came from Iraq and should be repatriated. That process was a bit of a scandal, and I think that they were hastily photographed. They have not yet been published in terms of an edition, text edition. And so this is often the case. I have a colleague in Spain who will look on Christie's, auction house listings for tablets that come up online. And when he finds a tablet, he'll take the photos and add that to the database that he's been making. So a lot of this work is done by keeping a close scrutinizing eye on the black market, essentially. So the idea around moving into computational methods is that we can leverage a lot of what computers do to help the kind of scarce resources around the images, translations, and languages that are inscribed on these objects. And since for a specialist, it does take around a second to distinguish these signs. It's clear that this is something that could be taught with enough supervision to computer. So the data itself is obviously multidimensional. There's writings on all 6 sides of these cubes, and they are written in many different directions, but typically left to right. So that is something of a challenge when we're photographing these, because there's sometimes writing on the edges that make it difficult. Hence the move towards 3D imaging and 3D objects. And that is a growing interest for engineers in machine learning, because we can more accurately describe each of the signs and their positions on the tablet, including other personal remains such as fingerprints and palm prints and things for demographic analysis. So there's many different forms of data that specialists work with, the photos or the tablet itself when possible. Most Assyriologists will work in what's called transliteration, which is rather than working with the Unicode signs, which do exist, they will make a reading of each sign. Orac does lemmatization, where they will link together the sense of the word and a part of speech tag with each normalized form of the word. And then we've also been working with entity recognition and identifying people and kings, royal names, and divine names. So some of these entities that appear on the tablets for the purposes of disambiguating all of these homonyms, these names across a collection of tablets. So there's, as Olaf said, there's about 350,000 tablets, and these exist in a number of databases. So it's not just one stop shopping, it's rather a challenge to know which website you should go to. You know, you go to CDLI for the image typically, you go to BDTNS for the Neo-Sumerian tablets, and Orac has then projects and the lemmatization of the text. So they each have different qualities and features, and their metadata, of course, is different. And this is all the more reason for a linked data project, so that these databases can continue doing what they have specialized in, but we can then link these together. And there's a number of these different databases that Assyriologists use regularly, and new ones that come up. Writing Sumerian is one that the University of Munich recently made. And so this is kind of an ongoing process. They're typically well known to all the specialists, and I think that the data is very often kind of accessible if you know how to access data at large, but not as accessible as a linked open data scenario would be in FactGrid, where you could download the data in mass with a query in a CSV file or in JSON file. That kind of quick downloading doesn't exist yet for any of these databases. So we're working on building authoritative sites for each of these so that we can add the data that we're collecting from them. We started with the Cuneiform inscriptions geographical site index that Rune Rottenberg and his colleagues in Sweden created. And with that, they found around 600 geographic locations where these tablets have come from so far. And I think that this gives us a good groundwork for building onto that, the kind of geographic data that occurs in the tablets as well. So that includes coordinates, when we know the coordinates of a tablet in a site, and then also any toponyms that are mentioned in ancient cities that are mentioned in the text as well. So attempting to link those variables. Other features that we're working on in addition to the geographic names mentioned on a tablet include the commodities that are listed there and the people, of course, as I mentioned, their roles, professions, families, patronymics, and then the kind of like context, the engrams, if you will, of the text for language modeling. Across all tablets, there's also a way of dating these, not only by explicit dates that are written on a tablet, but also the characteristics of a given tablet reveal its time period through the orthography, the way the signs are written. There's a lot of attention and interest in the archival nature of these objects, even though we rarely find them in an archival context. And the ability to kind of reconstruct archives has been something that specialists have been thinking about from the beginning. And there's, of course, a number of different features that we're interested in reconstructing for these, whether they were housed in an ancient library, like Ashurbanipal's library, or they're just personal dossiers. So the main goal that I've been focused on is what's called prosopographical disambiguation. So the idea that we could identify a number of people mentioned or names, mentioned across these tablets as people, as we identify that these instances correspond to one Shubellum or another. And in this archive that I've been working on, that spans about a century, you can see that a lot of these individuals are contemporary with one another. There's an overlap in terms of their lifespan, certainly their career even. And we can, count the texts that give evidence to a person or based on a patronymic, but not all names on a tablet have a patronymic. So there's a lot of variables that we want to take into consideration, including, the writing as it's impressed on a tablet. So all of these different features are ones that are valuable for disambiguating a person from all these name instances across the Cuneiform collection. I've been working with Nick Feldhaus at UC Berkeley for the last 5 years to do this for the Ur-3 tablets. They date between 2100 to 2000 BC, so another century in time. And we started with the archive from Pusrish Dagon, which was a kind of an ancient stock market, livestock exchange. And you can see we'll take in, so the Sumerian itself, they'll actually they'll use these words, ki, ta, and to kind of tag the role of a given name on a tablet. So there's kind of, emic or these native tags that the authors or scribes gave to these people, and we can use that strategically to reconstruct the network. So you can see here a small network that came from the treasure and leather texts. All of these other archives, are huge and interesting to explore. But this one in particular focuses on the king and the different merchants that are coming from what I assume to be up north in kind of Ashur, and also the kind of local military leaders, as well as some of the princesses or the daughters of the king are named in here as well. So there's just a lot of historical narrative that comes out of even like administrative archives like this, when you can aggregate them and start looking at these entities together. So this has been our focus since 2017 for this project, and this is just one of like at least 24 similar types of projects being conducted by other researchers throughout the field of Assyriology. So this is really kind of a standard practice, although our methods and what we're using are novel in many ways and cutting edge. We're doing some, you can see we're trying to do some time reconstruction, time series data with these tablets. You can see when the archive begins, its kind of rise and its collapse as well. So we can start to see within any year what that trade network looked like, more or less. So reconstructing time as well as place, these like spatial components of places that are mentioned in the tablet now, not just where the tablets come from, but actual locations that we know of currently that are actually mentioned in those texts. And that's another thing, that there's hundreds and hundreds more places that are mentioned in the text than we actually know of currently. So that gives us the opportunity to discover new sites that would potentially have tablets that we would discover in the future. These kind of geographical networks are very difficult to work with all these unknown variables. But again, using network analysis, we can kind of triangulate some of these through itineraries that are mentioned. So merchants would say it took us 3 days to go from point A to point B to point C. And so we could then say, well, if they're moving north or northeast, then we could hypothesize where some of those sites might be. So using some of the linked open data statements for these would be really interesting, not just for a discrete project like ours, but rather to share that more openly with others who might be interested, archaeologists and programmers that work with probability distributions to give us more accurate coordinates maybe. So these are kind of the features of the tablet that I've found so far in Wikidata that seem to be corresponding to the type of work that I've been doing, which include kind of the temporal components, the dates and time periods. Of course, they're not using Gregorian dates. We have to work with their dynasties and rulers, the cities and toponyms, and then also this lexicographical data that's there in the language of the tablets themselves. The FactGrid project is largely going to focus around the prosopography, since that's been my work for the last decade, and I think it's very fitting. The project, the only other project in this 500 BC range or 500 and before is on the Bible and Quran. It says where they analyzed or they gave URIs to each chapter and verse of the Bible, along with each name that's mentioned in the Bible. So very similar kind of intention there with at least that I have with these, that we give each tablet a URI, every line on the tablet, since that's how scholars work, line by line, and all of these named entities. So I think that these two will be pretty well paralleled. In terms of the outcomes, there is a lot of interest from archaeologists, especially, that the cultural heritage in these objects is dealt with properly and continues to be. The data needs to be accessible, which is why FactGrid and Wikibase and Wikidata is the right choice. And I think it provides a solid place for data that would otherwise be behind a paywall, like a publication like this, to start getting out and accessible to people. So the discovery projects are helping us build pipelines into FactGrid, and those include the Sumerian networks that I mentioned here, along with bibliographic data that corresponds to publications that have been made for the last couple of centuries and around these tablets. And I think that a lot of that gets blurred between primary sources and secondary sources, but the idea is that we will count the relationships and citations as they occur in publications. And that's already, we have over 150,000 books that we've identified, books and articles that we have identified. And so those links have also been modeled using different types of natural language processing tools, including topic modeling and BERT topics, and so that we can look at cosine similarity between any of these books that are writing about these cuneiform tablets, kind of flesh out the knowledge that's been created by scholarship over the years, and help provide access to researchers around the world. I still get emails from colleagues that are in Iraq, for example, saying, hey, we don't have any books that would help us translate these tablets that we have here. Can you help us? So that's another concern in my mind, is making sure that scholars who actually have a tablet in hand can make an addition and make their data accessible for all of us. So that is essentially the idea behind this linked open data project, creating greater access to the tablets themselves, along with the scholarship that surrounds them for all the invested parties that happen to stumble across one of these objects and it catches their interest. So I invite those interested to sign up. I created a form here that'll help create an account if you'd like to contribute. This will be an ongoing project for a while, and I look forward to collaborating with the scholarly community on this. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Wow, it's a big project. I'm wondering about the data masses we're looking at. That's 350,000 objects, and you
Yeah,
want to create items for all the lines in which something appears.
I know
Let's just consider it. Just
yeah,
to see what it is.
yeah. There's typically, well, it ranges, but let's say anywhere between 5 and 25 lines on a tablet.
Mhm.
So if, yeah, so if we take 350,000 and say that there's an average of 15 lines, that's 5 million
Okay.
objects.
Yeah.
I know it seems like a lot, but I think that the challenge for specialists is if there's not enough granularity in a database, then they won't use it. If all they have is the object itself, that becomes useful. But really, specialists read line by line, and they most of these databases already have line IDs
Yeah.
in them.
Yeah.
And so kind of preserving that structure within their data is going to be helpful for the way that Assyriologists work. Ideally, we would get down to each sign,
Yeah.
each word slash sign. But I think that would compound the number. That would give us, let's say, something like 100 million IDs if we were to ID each sign.
Yeah.
But it's moving in that direction, I think. And so this is a starting point where we're thinking about how do we deal with the prosopography on the one hand, but in order to really get to the prosopography and disambiguate a person, the orthography plays a big role in that, and there's a lot of challenges in dealing with the orthography. One of them has to do with the kind of scholarly conventions that have been made to read these signs. So the
Yeah.
readings of the signs, and that there needs to be even greater specificity for each sign in order to indicate was this sign written by this person or whatever, kind of identifying scribal hands.
Yeah. Wikidata has at the moment above 100 million items so far. I'm just thinking about, does it make sense going into that size? It's good to go into that size, but does it make sense to go into that size with a general compound, or would it make more sense to create actually a separate database just for spotting these things? As you showed me before, you had also the three-dimensional objects which you have printer ready for 3D printers, and the information for these items is again massive, so massive that it might make sense to actually go towards this idea of federated Wikibase instances, where you have a
Mm.
specialized instance that has all the objects together and a general instance that is more focused on the interpretation of these things, on the persons mentioned, the places mentioned, and all these things you've spoken about. What's your idea about that? Just looking at 100 million items which you just throw into the game.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that sounds good. I have only gotten my feet wet in Wikibase since May of last year, so I've just kind of been learning about it, even though I've been working with network analysis for longer. So that sounds like a good direction to be going in for sure, and I look toward to your guidance in that process. um, and so yeah, I think like finding the right medium here between like what is appropriate for FactGrid, and what should be, you know, moving more in the direction of a federated wiki base, um, is something I'm still filling out. So I'm certainly open to exploring that. And I think the reason I'm trying to like grasp at like this larger picture is that I have so many colleagues that are working on different aspects of these objects, you know. So I think trying to accommodate for the different types of research that I know is happening right now in creating like URIs for them to work with, uh, since that's really been a big challenge up until now. I mean, I've been in meetings around prosopography for these tablets, and the primary challenge that most programmers had up until now was how to make URIs for these objects in a reasonable way.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, that's the scale of that compounds when you think about, you know, getting down to an ID for every sign, which is what's needed if we're going into like 3D imaging. You know, you have, you know, each sign impressed on the tablet has a slightly different form, and certainly different coordinates as it exists on the tablet. Those coordinates, if they're embedded into the image itself, you can then simply reconstruct the 3D tablet scan that you've made just from the segmented images that have annotations on each one. I mean, like, so it's really getting into such a granularity now, that there's, I think, a need that will just continue to will be there, but just starting at least with URIs for the tablets, then the 350,000, I think is a really good place to begin and see how this works. And then, as you said, if it turns out that moving into something bigger to accommodate all these other applications makes more sense, then I'll make that move and kind of learn about it in the meantime.
I mean, the cool side is that if you put the information into FactGrid, we can actually have one reading for all the information you have. Like scholars working in a completely different field will realize that they can actually get the information from your database, and that's a fantastic thing. Like, you've dealt with fathers and mothers in different contexts, and you can suddenly find the same in your tablets, which normally would be completely unreadable. So the nice thing I feel is that we have the entire community being able to work with the informational content which you would create on this. That's what speaks for a joint project where you are in the middle of other projects using the same vocabulary, the same relationships between items. I just see when you come up to the point where you actually get individual characters and where they are on a clay tablet, that's such a minute piece of information, such a special thing that is already machine readable, that such a database is hardly made for a human eye. And we
Yeah,
are, in a way, made for a human eye.
yeah,
For someone who
yeah.
looks at a database object like he would look into an article on an object. So that speaks, in my view, for an additional very special database that uses the same software to actually go into into this particular data that helps you to create machine readable objects. In this
Yeah,
case, 3D
yeah,
printable objects on the same basis. And one,
exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I noticed, of course, like there's some overlap in the names with like the names that were already created from the Bible project that's in there. So there will be, some interesting connections that will link that project to this one in some ways, for at least for the first millennium. And
yeah, it's also
and I
general questions like mortality or like war, frequency of war in periods, or yeah, these things could be suddenly asked across the fields, and that's the nice thing of getting different projects onto the database. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. I think that we'll have some good coverage from the Middle East, at least for a number of millennia.
Yeah.
I know the other projects going in here, they're like one on the Ottoman Turkish texts. So there's going to be, quite a nice range of documents to think about, and especially the demographics that can be run there will be really interesting. And I know, that kind of like granularity that scholars work with, like individuals, people mentioned on a text, is just so key. And I think it's what makes these databases stand out, in that the triple statements can actually get down to that level and allow us to say, well, we don't know a person yet, but we know a name, and this name exists, and we're trying to establish the person. I mean, that's so much of the colleagues that I work with. It's so much of their work is just trying to get enough evidence to write a biographical sketch around a person from a collection of texts that has been dispersed all
Yeah.
across the world.
Hmm.
That's it's an incredible challenge, but I think that these databases are making it very possible. And I know every colleague I speak with, is always very grateful for greater access to this information. So I'm sure that for the specialists, all 500 of them or so, they'll be delighted. But I think the other parties that will be interested, will also find this really unique and useful. Archaeologists that tend to be separate from the kind of questions that seriologists are asking will now be able to integrate their work into the same sites and things that exist. So there's a lot of groundwork there that hasn't been made yet. So this kind of similar common context doesn't exist really, unfortunately, yet.
And the communities that are working in the field seem to be technically highly advanced. My feeling is when I look
Yeah.
at Baroque research, a database for them is something terrifying. And what I've seen your projects where people identify inscriptions and do this as a kind of crowdsourcing event, identify these characters on objects. Such things are totally cool to involve communities on work in these things. So you seem to have a community that is easygoing with modern research options, far though you're focusing on such old stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the cool things. I think that the tablets are still sometimes brand new when they come out of the ground, like this season. There'll be tablets that are coming out of the ground that, although they may be, 4,000 years old, it's the first time anyone's seen it since it was written. And I think that that's really different from the medieval manuscripts and the classical world, even, that have been edited, like all of the, biblical Hebrew texts, most definitely, have been, opined by rabbis and everyone else in between. And, that's really different. So there's this kind of newness to it all, and yet they teleport you. This is like a 3D printed object, but but you can see that it just by holding it, you can see that the characteristics of each sign impressed takes you back to that specific time period, even because those characteristics change over time. There's just so much about each human that's embedded in these that always specialists talk about. It's like what endears them to the work, that they feel so close to people who've been gone for so long.
Okay. What's your schedule of steps you want to take?
Yeah, that's a
You
great
put the
question.
places into the machine, and it's
Yeah.
already apparent. The highest density of places is in the old biblical field. And what's your next step?
Yeah. So like, yeah, by and large, most of the sites are in Iraq. And of course it's been excavated more so than anywhere else, more so than Syria. It's Kurdistan that a lot of specialists are looking at now, but it still seems that southern Iraq was really where the majority of these objects came from. So I think that I've been working with the catalogs of these databases so for um, at least 2 semesters, so about a year now. And um, each of these databases are going through changes at the moment as well. They're kind of getting into a 2.0 version, but they're relational databases. They're not in triple pairs. They don't work with the kind of linked data ontologies quite yet, or they're getting there. I think so. So I've been working on getting their data structured so that I can get meaningful triple pairs linked to each site. And that I'm hoping will happen before August so that I can get the 350,000 into Wikibase, FactGrid before August. And then, and then there's, so I'm also working with the Google Summer of Code with the CDLI, and so there's a couple of projects there that are going to add in the bibliographic references into the mix, as well as some of the other features that we mentioned in the tablets. So that will be happening this summer as the Summer of Code runs up until September, I think, or so. And then there's kind of like these specialized projects, the network for Draham that I mentioned, and then the network from Anatolia. Those I'll work on getting the kind of metadata that exists only in these discrete studies that have been done, getting that into the database as well. Because, for example, the old Assyrian texts from Turkey that we saw in the very beginning, um, there there was a database made on FileMaker that I've been kind of working with since around 2011, and nobody else has access to that aside from like a handful of scholars. So I'm trying to connect that in first so that that data then becomes accessible to others. I think it's something that has been on my mind. And I've published some of the data in network forms recently, like through GitHub. Back in, I think, 2017, I put some of these network models on GitHub, but colleagues will say they don't know how to use that. So I think if I can get these triples into FactGrid, then they will be queryable at least, and that will become more useful. So those are kind of the benchmarks I have in mind, but I also know that there will be, well, there's a couple of discussions taking place about in other kind of workshops where colleagues with databases themselves come to these workshops and talk about features for prosopography, and then they go and implement those changes. So I think there'll be another wave of entities that will get added in the near future. But yeah, all of that will probably happen this year, I'm assuming, like at least the initial URIs for the tablets and then some of the entity work after that.
Yeah, we should try to get as many people on it as possible because yeah, that should be an initiative to have people actually working with it. The bigger the community is that learns how to use such technologies, the the smaller the risk that you create something where you're alone with.
Yeah,
So I
yeah. I mean,
seriously hope that we have a
I
like 500 people working with it. That's the coolest scenario I can imagine, and offering
yeah,
500 accounts would be just superb. That's
yeah,
what we should do.
absolutely. Yeah, and I know that the CDLI gets used every day by a large number of people who want access to the data, want to download it. So
Yeah.
it's difficult to download data from these online databases, and so this at least would be a place where people could access that. But the other thing is the making the URIs accessible in the databases. So pushing that data is something that we've been talking about, and so I'm trying to set up pipelines
Mm.
that can then once we've generated these IDs, then we can distribute them back to the sources that are kind of hosting the data that are already well known. And then those URIs would obviously direct people into the project as well. So as they click on, an entity, then their page of statements would appear all of a sudden. So I think that kind of traffic will be something that will happen very naturally once we get these pipelines set up.
Yeah, exactly. Eventually, we should be able to bring data from FactGrid onto other sites because the data is machine readable. So another site somewhere else at another university can easily grab the data and bring it on their search module. That's
Yeah, yeah, that's the cool thing to think about, these ways in which new debate databases will take shape now. Whereas in the past there've only been like two or three hubs of
mm,
information, and they have like a very specific use, like
yeah,
they're intentional, almost like canonical museum catalog kind of places. Well, think of like the cool type of databases that can happen with deep learning, machine learning, like all of these new technologies, machine translation. I mean, it's been explored to some degree, but it's very difficult. These languages are very difficult to work with computationally,
mm,
um, and we need more programmers to tool it up, like all the universal dependencies and things. So even just opening up the data for those avenues of research
absolutely.
are really exciting, I think.
Okay. Well, I think we should round it off here.
Yeah,
Well,
sounds good. Thank you
sounds
so
good.
much, Olaf. Again, it was
I thank
great.
you, and I'm extremely curious about what you're gonna do with that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Shalmama.
August is good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll put this
Sounds
online
good.
on YouTube for
Yeah,
anyone to follow,
awesome.
and I wish you a nice rest of the day. Huh?
Yeah, thank you so much. You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.